Hello friends! One of the biggest global issues in recent decades is mass migration, and it mainly affects Western Europe and the US.
A small group of people ran up to the fence. It is time for the global north to pay for everything.
This is one of the biggest issues in Dutch politics right now.
ICE go away from LA. ICE go away from LA.
Should there be less immigration or more?
It must be stopped.
For different reasons, millions of people are moving in search of a better life to countries like Germany, the UK, France, the US, and others. Locals often see these newcomers as a source of social problems. On my channel, I often talk about migrants in different countries. Not because it's a hot topic, you can see this problem everywhere. People are worried about mass migration and the challenges it brings. Migrants themselves worry about their integration into new societies. In my previous videos, I've documented both the problems migrants create and the ones they face abroad. But the question is, where are people fleeing from and why? Some flee instability, crises, or dictatorships. Others look for jobs and a better life. And in some cases, migration is a tool of foreign policy or a way to raise budgets. Some governments deliberately send their citizens abroad so they can send money back home, which helps the country's economy. You'd probably think that most people are fleeing from developing or poor countries, but nope, not really. At the top of the list, there are actually some well-off countries. And right now, I'm gonna show you where people are really leaving from, explain why it's happening, and why for some countries, losing people is actually profitable. But first, friends, go ahead and hit that like button on this video and subscribe to Ilya Varlamov, because all my videos are posted right here. So how do you figure out where people are fleeing from? At first glance, it seems simple. International organizations publish data on refugees and migrants. First of all, the UN, in their reports, there's a metric called net migration. That's basically the difference between people moving in and out of the country over a year. If the number is negative, the country is losing people, but this raw number doesn't answer the key question about the reasons of migration, and it doesn't show whether the migration outflow is actually a big problem for them. Here's what the top 10 countries with the highest outflow look like. This table is based on UN data, adjusted by demographer Alexei Raksha, who we consulted while making this video. First, he'll explain why those UN numbers need adjusting.
This is Alexei Raksha, a demographer from a Rosstat employee, specializing in Russian and global demographics.
See, the UN database actually has some big mistakes. For example, in 1990, Georgia was counted with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but in recent decades it's counted without them. So it looks like people are leaving the country, but actually Abkhazia and South Ossetia are just in a black zone, and the UN didn't get data from there. According to the UN, they're part of Georgia, but their populations aren't added to the part of Georgia that reports to the UN.
According to the table of total migration outflow, the leaders are Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, countries with huge populations where many people live in extreme poverty. The numbers for Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan don't show the full picture of global migration. To get a better understanding, we need another metric: the share of people leaving compared to the total population. Here the picture looks different. For example, almost half of Moldovans have been living abroad over the past 30 years. But that's not all. There's a third metric that really shows how significant migration is for a country: total population decline. Basically, we add natural population growth or decline to migration inflow and outflow. As a result, we get a list of countries where the population shrunk the most over the last 30 years. Here, the picture changes completely. So right now, I'm going to explain to you each metric in detail and show the most interesting countries on the lists. Let's start with total migration outflow. Bangladesh and Pakistan are obvious leaders. These are some of the world's most populous countries where labor migration has been established over decades. People leave for work, often return, and send money home to support their families. But in this table, there are countries that deserve a closer look. The Philippines, Venezuela, Sudan, and Ukraine. Technically, they're listed alongside India and Bangladesh, but they are completely different. Take the Philippines. This country turned migration into a smart national strategy. About 10 million Filipinos work abroad constantly, sending $40 billion back home. Just imagine, that's about a tenth of the country's entire GDP. In recent years, labor migration has become the Philippines' main export.
The Philippine Overseas Employment Administration announced that there will be more opportunities for citizens to work abroad this year. The most in-demand jobs in the Middle East are welders, pipe fitters, and electricians. Filipino workers stand out for their skills and work ethic, which gives them an edge over other labor migrants.
The Philippines have a huge, young, and growing population, around 115 million people, but not nearly enough jobs. Every year, more young people enter the job market than the economy can support. So the country has two choices: either create jobs and grow the economy, or take the shortcut and send the surplus workforce to countries that need workers. The Philippines chose the second option.
I'm glad to point out that the Philippines' efforts to manage uncontrolled population growth is a problem that governments around the world are watching closely. The Philippines know the risks this problem brings, especially since the country's population grows by 3.2% every year. This is one of the highest rates in the world. The state can't keep up with this pace, and without action, demand will soon outstrip the government's ability to take care of its citizens.
This system was created 50 years ago, and in 1982, the government founded a state employment agency, the POEA, which began centrally training, certifying, and sending Filipinos abroad. Since then, the Philippines have turned into a state-run factory producing workers for export and responding to the needs of the global market. Need nurses for the US or Europe? No problem. Filipinos are the world's largest exporter of nurses. They are trained to US standards, prepared to pass licensing exams and sent abroad to work. Need seafarers? Easy. About 25% of all sailors worldwide are Filipinos. That's about 500,000 people. Specialized maritime academies prepare huge numbers of skippers and helmsmen. Need construction workers or programmers? Here you go. Professionals with excellent English and targeted training. And that's not even mentioning the famous Filipino nannies. They're also a product of this labor export industry. It's gone so far that the Philippines now have a full-scale propaganda machine designed to encourage immigration. It started with a single decree. In 1988, Philippine President Corazon Aquino officially declared labor migrants the country's new heroes, Bagong Bayani. The comparison was clear, just as past heroes died for freedom. People today give their lives for the country's economic survival. And it's not just talk. It's a state ideology with its own rituals. Every year, the best-performing migrants are honored at the presidential palace and congratulated by the head of government. There are even parades held in their honor. But behind this facade is a strict social contract. The state gives migrants hero status, preferential insurance, and even seats in parliament. And in return, it demands one thing: a regular cash remittances. The system feeds itself. The more people leave, the more families get used to good money coming from abroad. That creates a perfect cycle. The state trains people, then they leave and send money home. The state gets richer and invests in training new people. So the Philippines function like a corporation.
Unemployment in October reached nearly 12%. That means 5.81 million underemployed Filipinos were actively looking for side jobs to earn extra money.
Another major country with high migration outflow is Venezuela. Over the past 30 years, about 5.1 million people have left the country. But if we look only at the last 10 years and only count those who left without including newcomers, the number jumps to 7 million people. That's 1 out of every 4 Venezuelans. and many of them left on foot. In Venezuela's case, this is literally a kind of exodus, thousands of kilometers with children and bags. The main reason is the political regime of Nicolas Maduro and his predecessor Hugo Chavez. Under their rule, the country is stuck in a permanent economic crisis. That's hard to survive. Colombia has taken around 3 million migrants. Peru, about 1.5 million. Ecuador and Chile, another 500,000 over the past decade. Many of those leaving were doctors, engineers, programmers, teachers. But not only them. Poor people are fleeing too. And that often becomes a problem for the host countries. Venezuela is probably a unique case. It doesn't have a huge population, and people aren't fleeing a war. What destroyed the country was hyperinflation, corruption, and the collapse of state functions. That's very different from Sudan and South Sudan. These two countries were actually one state not that long ago, and now people are fleeing both war and poverty. Over the past 30 years, has totaled about 4,560,000 people. In 2011, South Sudan split off from Sudan. Both countries remained extremely poor. Then in April 2023, war broke out in Sudan itself, pitting the National Army against the Rapid Support Forces, a massive, heavily armed group. Despite the name, it's not an army or police unit. It's a private military force that controlled key industries for years. For example, gold mining. And now it's fighting for full control of the country. The war triggered massive migration. More than 3 million people fled Sudan in just over 2 years after April 2023. Because most people are poor and can't easily escape far away, they mostly flee to neighboring countries, such as Chad, Egypt, and Ethiopia. But around 9 million people couldn't leave the country at all. They abandoned their homes and became refugees in their own country. They live in camps or stay with relatives, trying to survive the war and total collapse. The same is happening in South Sudan. It's the youngest country in the world. It appeared on the map in 2011, and just 2 years later, in 2013, this newborn state was already plunged into a civil war. The president and vice president, who were allies, ended up fighting for power and control over the country's oil. The conflict was also fueled by ethnic tensions in South Sudan. The Dinka and Nuer peoples started fighting each other. Mass killings and famine forced people to leave their homes. Formally, a peace agreement was signed in 2018, but nothing got better. The country is still in ruins. There are 2.5 million internally displaced people who are still unable to go home after 10 years. Africa is the fastest growing region in the world. There are a lot of young people, and more countries are coming out of extreme poverty.
Based on indirect data and other countries' comparisons, mobility tends to increase as economic development rises. Africa is growing faster than the global average. Of course, starting from a very low base, which makes rapid growth easier. Mobility is rising, meaning more people are moving not just to neighboring countries, but also across continents. The number of refugees and economic migrants is increasing. The only thing slowing them down are the barriers in destination countries. I think this trend is only going to keep accelerating exponentially.
The third largest population outflow over the past 30 years is from Ukraine. The war, lasting almost 4 years, isn't the only reason.
Russia hit Ukraine's critical infrastructure and border areas.
Ukrainians started leaving en masse for work back in the early 90s. It was rather a slow process than a sudden rush. People left gradually, year by year, because wages at home were low and higher abroad. After 2014, labor migration increased sharply. The Ukrainians went to Poland to work on farms and in factories. In fact, Ukrainian migrants played a big part in Poland's economic boom in the 2010s. Today, Poland is Europe's fastest growing economy. On the flip side, during this period, Ukrainian labor migrants sent about $15 billion home each year. The economic situation in Ukraine wasn't improving, so labor migration to Poland continued. Then in 2022, the war started. By March 4th, 2024, 2 years into a war, about 6.5 million people had left Ukraine. This is Europe's biggest simultaneous movement of people since World War II. Europe made special legal arrangements for Ukrainian refugees. They were given temporary protection. This status let them work, study, and access health care. Fleeing the war has become a major problem for Ukraine. Peace negotiations haven't made much progress, whatever Trump might promise. So it's unclear who will go back or when. Over the years, Ukrainian refugees began integrating into Europe, and returning home will be hard for many of them. All right, now let's look at a metric, but that shows a very different picture. It answers the question of how damaging migration is for a particular country. Bangladesh and India aren't in the top, but there are many small island nations. We'll skip those too, because sometimes people move there just to get a passport and then leave. Plus, some of these countries are so tiny that if a dozen people leave, it looks like a disaster in the UN data. But among all these microstates, there's one case that's completely different: Moldova. And here, one detail is important. In the data we're looking at, there's a line labeled Moldova and Transnistria. Why is that? Because the UN relies on official statistics, and Moldova's official stats don't include Transnistria, which Chisinau doesn't control today. To get the full picture, demographers, including Alexei Raksha, combine the numbers and get about 22.8 million people, and that's minus 49% over 30 years. You heard me right. In 30 years, Moldova lost half its population to migration. So let's figure out how that happened and why Moldovan migration is among Europe's most striking examples.
When it comes to Moldova, the UN numbers might actually be close to the truth, even though they systematically undercount the outflow. The UN actually didn't count Transnistria, yet migration from both Moldova and Transnistria was so huge that within a few years Moldova lost a population equivalent to all of Transnistria.
The first reason for this was the collapse of the USSR. According to the World Bank, Moldova's industrial output in the early 90s dropped by more than 60%. An economy built around the Soviet market was paralyzed. On top of that, in 1992, an armed conflict broke out in Transnistria. After the USSR fell, a large part of the Russian population lived on the left bank of the Dniester with Moldovans and Ukrainians. Up to 40% of Moldova's industry was concentrated there. A few months of fighting, hundreds dead, and Moldova lost control of its main factories in Tiraspol, Rabnica, and Bender.
It escalated into armed conflict that lasted 5 months.
Officially, over 1,000 people died.
The 14th Army, which was under Russian command at the time, played a key role in ending the war. It was the biggest and most capable military force in the region. Russia officially stayed neutral, but some units of the 14th Army sided with the Transnistrians. Later, President Yeltsin openly admitted this.
And this was the 90s. In independent Moldova and in other former Soviet republics, unemployment and poverty were major problems. Add an armed conflict, hitting an already collapsing industry. As a result, Moldovans sought work elsewhere, and between 30 and 50 headed to Russia and Ukraine. According to the World Bank, by the late 90s, 1 in 3 Moldovan families was surviving thanks to money sent home by relatives working abroad. Most often, a husband, father, or brother went abroad for work. Simply put, classic guest workers. Everything changed in the 2000s, but no, Moldovans didn't return home. Instead, they began moving west. Moldova didn't join the EU, but many of its citizens got EU passports because Romania did. Back in 1991, Moldovans could get Romanian passports under the repatriation law. According to Romania's Ministry of Justice, around 900,000 Moldovan citizens have received Romanian passports thanks to this program. That's roughly 1 in 4 Moldovans over 30 years. Then in 2007, Romania joined the EU. So Moldovans with Romanian passports got the right to work anywhere in the EU. Migration routes shifted west. People started going to Italy, Portugal, Spain, and later the UK. They began with seasonal work and later took steady jobs. They got residence permits and brought their families there. According to Italian authorities, as of January 1st, 2023, nearly 110,000 Moldovan citizens were living in Italy. But the money kept flowing back home, just like from Russia and Ukraine. According to the World Bank, from 2006 to 2008, remittances made up 30-35% of Moldova's GDP, ranking among the highest in the world. Just think about it for a second. It's interesting why Italy attracted so many Moldovan migrants. There are 2 factors that turned it into a magnet for Moldovans.
This is Alexander Makuhin.
A political scientist, sociologist, and expert in migration and demographics from Moldova.
Italy is Europe's oldest country in terms of population age. They realized long ago that attracting migrants is critical. Here we talk about a cultural and historical context. I'll give you my own example. I came back from a conference in Rome just a few days ago. I've never learned Italian, but I know Romanian, so I could understand most of my colleagues without translation. And this linguistic closeness still works in Italy.
Today, Moldova is a candidate to join the EU. Chișinău's most optimistic forecasts suggest full EU integration by 2030. But in a way, Moldova is already part of it, since so many people already have Romanian passports. The question is whether joining the EU will make migration rise, or if the economic benefits will actually bring people back home.
We can actually say that a lot of Moldovans are fully integrated into the EU. In fact, they are integrated even more than, for example, Latvians or Lithuanians before their countries joined the EU. So, Moldovan citizens can work in the European Union, and they're doing it already. They can also move freely across the EU and take advantage of all the opportunities it offers. Overall, when we talk about how EU membership might affect migration, in this case, I guess it won't make much of a difference.
Migration from Moldova has changed over time. Sociologists say that almost half of those leaving now have a university degree. This is intentional career migration. Doctors, IT specialists, and engineers are going to Germany, Ireland, or Poland. Most have no plans to come back. And here's an interesting paradox. According to Moldova's National Bank, remittances as a share of GDP have dropped to about 10%. Not because people send less money, but because they're moving permanently with their families. Remittances stop once you brought your kids and parents over.
I would actually say it's time to reconsider the old approach that says that we have a big diaspora, but one day they'll come back. Instead, the focus should be on investing in two things: education and support for young families and mothers. We need to concentrate on these three aspects. It will have a much bigger impact. I mean, it will have a bigger economic, social, and demographic impact than trying to influence people who have already left. When the standard of living in your country improves, people start thinking about returning. European countries are leading in population decline. Over the past 35 years, the population in this region has been decreasing. It is happening mostly due to natural population decline. But many of them are also experiencing migration outflows. So it's really a double hit. Put differently, people are leaving while the birth rate remains low.
I'll talk more about this double hit in the final part. These countries face the greatest challenges. When we look at total population decline, over the last 30 years, we don't see starving African countries or Latin American dictatorships. Well, except Cuba, which is near the bottom, having lost just about 10% of its population in 30 years. And then there's the Vatican, which makes the list for obvious reasons. Citizens are elderly priests and nuns, and church rules aren't exactly helping the Vatican grow. In fact, the Vatican might want to allow visa-free entry. Plus, a Vatican passport can be revoked if someone leaves church service. And if it's a cleric with a family, all family members lose their documents too. But what about Lithuania and Latvia? You'd think these are fairly well-off European countries. Their populations were already small, but in the last 30 years, both have shrunk by more than 20%. Together, they've lost about 1.4 million people. That's roughly the whole population of Estonia. If you look at when and how the population fell, the sharpest drop happened right after 1991. Lithuania and Latvia sought independence from the USSR and saw the Soviet era as a period of occupation. But demographically, they were hit hardest right after it ended. Their economies were closely tied to Moscow, and once those ties were broken, problems like those in other former Soviet republics arose immediately. For example, the Riga FEV factory was left with no orders. It used to be one of the largest industrial enterprises, supplying phones and electronics to the entire USSR.
Every product from the transistor plant has the official quality seal, but could they work so effectively without the plant number 1, the company cafeteria? Watch and judge for yourself. Sociologists have already figured out that thanks to high-quality catering, labour productivity increased by 7 to 8%.
The shutdown of similar enterprises led to labor migration, primarily to Russia. Ethnic Russian scientists, military engineers, and people assigned to Latvia through the Soviet job placement system went to Russia. Ethnic Germans and Jews moved to Western countries or to Israel, taking advantage of repatriation programs. Moreover, in Latvia, an entirely new category of people known as non-citizens appeared. These were mostly Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, who didn't automatically get citizenship, unlike in Lithuania. They had to go through naturalization procedures, including language and history exams. At its peak in the mid-1990s, there were about 730,000 non-citizens, almost a third of Latvia's population. They received non-citizen passports, couldn't vote or take certain government jobs. Many of them still refuse to become Latvian citizens. As a matter of principle, labor migration from Latvia and Lithuania to the west began in the 2000s. On May 1st, 2004, all the Baltic states officially joined the European Union, but under special conditions. Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians faced up to 7 years of work restrictions in the EU under a transitional period. There were only 3 exceptions, which allowed them access to the labor markets, the UK, Ireland, and Sweden. And that was enough. A handyman in London or Dublin could make 5 to 10 times more than in Riga or Vilnius. After 2008, there was another major wave of emigration from Latvia and Lithuania, this time driven by the global financial crisis. By then, the 7-year work ban for their citizens hadn't fully expired yet, but some countries decided to ease the restrictions. Germany, for example, began simplifying relocation rules for highly skilled professionals, and a new wave of emigration followed. Today, Latvia and Lithuania are fairly prosperous countries with growing economies, but people are still leaving. In short, despite that prosperity, working and living conditions in Central and Western Europe are still better than at home. A young doctor in Latvia earns between 1,100 euros and 5,200 euros a month before taxes. In Germany, it's between $3,000 and $15,000. Of course, living costs differ there, but even after taxes, life in Central Europe is still better financially. At the same time, host countries are interested in doctors, IT specialists, scientists, and construction workers with EU passports who are unlikely to burden taxpayers, unlike migrants from poor countries. As a result, Latvia and Lithuania lose up to 1% of their population every year.
Over the past 30 years, the largest population losses have been recorded in Ukraine, Bulgaria, Latvia, Serbia, Hungary, Belarus, and Russia. Over the last 30 to 35 years, all of these Eastern European countries have declined immediately after 1990. They either never fully recovered from it, or, like in Russia's case, saw brief growth for 3 to 4 years before natural population decline returned. In the foreseeable future, none of these countries will see natural population growth. Currently, natural population decline affects 30-40 countries, and that number is growing fast. We can observe it across nearly all of Europe. It's easier to list countries where it hasn't started.
Setting aside individual countries, another clear pattern emerges in overall population decline. There are entire regions that have been losing people for decades. For instance, Latin America and the Caribbean. But why? What pushes millions of people from what seem like viable countries to keep heading north? The answer goes beyond economics.
It's relatively easy to leave Latin America and the Caribbean. For example, for the US, France, or other metropolis, Martinique and Guadeloupe. Or let's take Montserrat, which was badly hit by volcanic eruptions. But there's also massive outmigration from Puerto Rico and from Central America as well. For example, from El Salvador.
There's one country where migration doesn't happen naturally, but is used as a political tool. The authorities didn't just ignore people leaving, they organized it on purpose, using it to blackmail the US and to obtain political and economic concessions. This country is Cuba. It feels like Cuba is competing in some kind of migration Olympics, trying to break new records. In 2022, 224,000 Cubans crossed the US border. By the way, back in 2015, the number was 5 times less. In 2023, another 200,000 followed. In the past, people risked their lives to reach the US, building rafts from barrels and tires and floating 150 km to Florida. Now there's a new route, perfected to run like clockwork. Cubans buy a flight ticket to Nicaragua because since November 2021, no visa is required for them. From welcoming Nicaragua, they cross illegally into Honduras and then trek through Guatemala and Mexico to the long-awaited US border. They head to the same country Cuban authorities demonized for decades. The situation in Cuba has gotten so bad that it set off the largest migration wave. In 2023 alone, 153,000 people left the country via the land border between Mexico and the United States. Of course, this is the result of the system set up under Fidel Castro. And right now, his supporters continue his work. Here's what comes out of it. According to Cuba's Human Rights Monitoring Center, as of 2023, 88% of Cubans live in extreme poverty. Incomes can't keep up with hyperinflation. 70% of essential meds aren't available. Every second household faces power and water cuts. The state can't even provide basic necessities anymore. After Castro came to power, attitudes toward emigration in Cuba changed. In the early years, leaving the country was strictly banned. By the mid-1960s, the authorities realized that the bans weren't working. People kept trying to escape, many dying at sea, and the US used each case for propaganda. That's why Cuba changed tactics. The government legalized migration and took it under control. The culmination of this policy came in 1980. Authorities announced that anyone could leave freely through the port of Mariel. In just a few months, about 125,000 Cubans sailed to Florida. And this is based solely on American sources. Castro didn't just let people leave, he deliberately funneled criminals and patients from psychiatric institutions to make Washington's problems even worse. And the move worked. After the Mariel crisis, the US had to negotiate with Cuba and sign a migration agreement, effectively recognizing Havana's right to manage its population outflow. From that point on, emigration stopped. Being just an internal problem for Cuba's leaders, it became a tool of political leverage.
In 1980, Local 10 documented the migrant crisis. Fidel Castro, then in charge, allowed Cubans to leave. By the time it was all over,
Besides that, Cuban authorities had achieved more than just a quick geopolitical win over the US. In the long run, this exodus produced an unexpected economic effect. New migrants integrated into the US economy and sent money back to their families on the island. This peaked in the 1990s. After the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba lost its subsidies, plunging into a severe economic crisis. The peak of this cynical strategy came with the Balceros crisis of 1994. Tens of thousands of Cubans, driven to desperation by economic collapse, set off for Florida on homemade rafts. Instead of stopping them, Havana negotiated with Washington and secured an official quota. The US agreed to issue at least 20,000 visas per year. Just think about it. A small island dictates a superpower. How many of its citizens to accept?
Listen, we have a massive food problem. With 100 pesos, a Cuban can't survive. It's impossible. We don't get health care. We have to buy meds with dollars. No dollars, no aspirin. If you're diag, no one will help you. Our markets are empty. And if you find something, you still need dollars.
We don't need luxury or an American-style life. A Cuban doesn't need luxury. Cuban needs the most basic things. Toothpaste, a toothbrush, simple things that just don't exist in this country. And this isn't just the US embargo. It's the blockade we made ourselves. This system is the problem.
Cuban migrants still head to the US for a better life. Meanwhile, the island of freedom is slowly dying. This doesn't seem to bother the authorities much, though. Money still comes in from the US, but with Trump declaring war on illegal migration, it's not that simple anymore. There's a kind of blind spot in my story at the silence. You probably expected Russia to appear in these rankings, but surprisingly, migration still isn't a major demographic problem for Russia. And that's despite the massive outflow in 2022, right after the war in Ukraine began and mobilization was announced. According to the Russia Project's research for 2022-2023, Russia's total net migration loss was around 1 million people. However, if we look at UN data, it didn't create serious problems for the state. According to Russia's official statistics agency, in 2022, Russia saw a net migration gain of nearly 62,000. Important caveat, the reliability of these official numbers has been questioned for years. Around 500,000 people who left because of the war and never returned were barely reflected in the statistics.
But even if they were included, Russia's net migration loss over the past 3 years would still be relatively small, especially when you take into account migrants arriving from poorer countries, mainly Central Asia, and not only from there. Most of Russia's population decline comes from natural causes. And here's what the situation looks like. We should consider both births and deaths. Both high mortality and low birth rates contribute more or less equally to the population decline. Russia's birth rate is similar to Europe's, but mortality is much higher, especially among young and middle-aged men. And it's not just because of the war.
Well, serious problems likely lie ahead for Russia. For now, migration is hitting other countries harder, though. Whether people are fleeing dangerous places like Sudan or leaving relatively stable regions, the reason is the same. They're looking for a better future. Some countries lose people slowly over decades. Others lose them fast. Sometimes it's all about economics, as in the Philippines. And sometimes it's a national disaster. At the same time, host countries confront serious issues. How should they integrate newcomers? How could they avoid conflicts caused by mass migration? And what about cultural differences? In short, migration is one of the key global challenges today. Friends, write in the comments what you think. Maybe you're a migrant yourself. Share your story. Tell me what you think about migrants if you live in a hotspot. And don't forget to subscribe to Ilya Varlamov. That's where I post my most interesting videos. Sending hugs to everyone. Bye-bye. See you soon.